brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that supports life and family. 5% of your monthly plan price goes to your favorite charity. Buy the way you believe at CharityMobile.com and use promo code TRADITION. To truly understand the crisis in the church, we should probably pay close attention to the possibly greatest teacher about the crisis in the church, Pope St. Pius X. He understood the nature of it, the heresies that underlie it, and how the heresy that he called modernism was the synthesis of all heresies. How every single heresy the church has ever dealt with is represented in some small way in the greater heresy of modernism. The modernists essentially won the day at Vatican II and its implementation, not just at the implementation, but also in the writing of the documents itself. Hence why you see religious liberty, which had been condemned by the church, suddenly now endorsed by the church, a century later in the documents of Vatican II. And there was a tug of war going on in the church afterwards, and it continues today. And for the last year or so, I have been covering this document, Pope St. Pius X's Pascendi Dominici Gregis, in small pieces. And we're getting close to the end now. Today we're going to talk about the causes of modernism and its propagation, how the modernists achieve what they achieve. This is key to understanding this crisis in the church. So now we turn to Pope St. Pius X on the causes and propagation of modernism. To penetrate still deeper into modernism and to find a suitable remedy for such a deep sore, it behooves us, venerable brethren, to investigate the causes which have engendered it and which foster its growth. That the proximate and immediate cause consists in a twisting of the mind cannot be open to doubt. The remote causes seem to us to be reduced to two: curiosity and pride. Curiosity by itself, if not prudently regulated, suffices to explain all errors. Such is the opinion of our predecessor Gregory XVI, who wrote, "A lamentable spectacle is that presented by the aberration of human reason when it yields to the spirit of novelty, when against the warning of the apostles it seeks to know beyond what is meant to know, and when, relying too much on itself, it thinks it can find the fruit outside the church, wherein truth is found without the slightest shadow of error. But it is pride which exercises an incomparably greater sway over the soul to blind it and plunge it into error, and pride sits in modernism as in its own house, finding sustenance everywhere in its doctrines and an occasion to flaunt itself in all its aspects. It is pride which fills modernists with that confidence in themselves and leads them to hold themselves up as the rule for all. Pride which puffs them up with that vainglory which allows them to regard themselves as the sole possessors of knowledge, and makes them say, inflated with presumption, "We are not as the rest of men," and which, to make them really not as other men, leads them to embrace all kinds of the most absurd novelties. It is pride which rouses in them the spirit of disobedience, and causes them to demand a compromise between authority and liberty. It is pride that makes of them the reformers of others, while they forget to reform themselves, and which begets their absolute want of respect for authority, not accepting the supreme authority. No, truly, there is no road which leads so directly and so quickly to modernism as pride. When a Catholic layman or a priest forgets that precept of the Christian life which obliges us to renounce ourselves if we would follow Jesus Christ, and neglects to tear pride from his heart, but he is a fully ripe subject to the errors of modernism. Hence, venerable brethren, it will be your first duty to thwart such proud men, to employ them only in the lowest and obscure offices. The higher they try to rise, the lower let them be placed, so that their lowly position may deprive them of the power of causing damage. Sound your young clerics too most carefully, by yourselves and by the directors of your seminaries, and when you find the spirit of pride among any of them, reject them without compunction from the priesthood. Would to God that this had always been done with the proper vigilance and constancy. If we pass from the moral to the intellectual causes of modernism, the first which presents itself, and the chief one, is ignorance. Yes, these very modernists who pose as doctors of the church, who puff out their cheeks when they speak of modern philosophy, and show such contempt for scholasticism, have embraced the one with all its false glamour, because their ignorance of the other has left them without the means of being able to recognize confusion of thought, and to refute sophistry. Their whole system, with all its errors, has been born of the alliance between faith and false philosophy. The methods of modernism. If only they had displayed less zeal and energy in propagating it, but such is their activity, and such their unwearying capacity for work on behalf of their cause, that one cannot be but pained to see them waste such labor in endeavoring to ruin the church when they might have been of such service to her had their efforts been better employed. Their articles to delude men's minds are of two kinds. The first to remove obstacles from their path, the second to devise and apply actively and patiently every instrument that can serve their purpose. They recognize that the three chief difficulties for them are scholastic philosophy, the authority of the fathers and tradition, and the magisterium of the church, and on these they wage unrelenting war. Their scholastic philosophy and theology they have only ridicule and contempt. Whether it is ignorance or fear or both that inspires this conduct in them, certain it is that the passion for novelty is always united in them with hatred of scholasticism, and there's no surer sign that a man is on the way to modernism than when he begins to show his dislike for the system. Modernists and their admirers should remember the proposition condemned by Pius IX. The method and principles which have served the doctors of scholasticism when treating of theology no longer correspond with the exigencies of our time or the progress of science. That's an excerpt from the Syllabus of Errors, meaning it's a condemned statement. They exercise all their ingenuity in diminishing the force and falsifying the character of tradition, so as to rob it of all its weight. Before the Catholics, the Second Council of Nicaea will always have the force of law, where it condemns those who dare, after the impious fashions of heretics, to deride the ecclesiastical traditions, to invent novelties of some kind, or endeavor by malice or craft to overthrow any one of the legitimate traditions of the Catholic Church. And Catholics who hold for law also the profession of the Fourth Council of Constantinople. We therefore profess to conserve and guard the rules bequeathed to the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, by the holy and illustrious apostles, by the Orthodox councils, both general and local, and by every one of those divine interpreters, the fathers and doctors of the Church. Wherefore the Roman pontiffs, Pius IV and Pius IX, ordered the insertion in the profession of faith of the following declaration: I most firmly admit and embrace the apostolic and ecclesiastical traditions and other observances and constitutions of the Church. The modernists pass the same judgment on the most holy fathers of the Church as they pass on tradition, decreeing with amazing effrontery that, while personally most worthy of all veneration, they were entirely ignorant of history and criticism, for which they are only excusable on account of the time in which they lived. Finally, the modernists try in every way to diminish and weaken the authority of the ecclesiastical magisterium itself by sacrilegiously falsifying its origin, character, and rights, and by freely repeating the calumnies of its adversaries. To all the band of modernists may be applied those words which our predecessor wrote with such pain: to bring contempt and odium on the mystic spouse of Christ, who is the true light, the children of darkness have been wont to cast in her face before the world a stupid calumny, and perverting the meaning and force of things and words, to depict her as the friend of darkness and ignorance, and the enemy of light, science, and progress. See his motu proprio ut mysticum, given on 14th of March, 1891. This being so, venerable brethren, no wonder the modernists vent all their gall and hatred on Catholics, who sturdily fight the battles of the Church. But all the insults they heap on them, those of ignorance and obstinacy, are the favorites. When an adversary rises up against them with an irradiation and force that render him redoubtable, they try to make a conspiracy of silence around him to nullify the effects of his attack, while in flagrant contrast with this policy towards Catholics, they load with constant praise the writers who range themselves on their side, hailing their works, excluding novelty in every page, with choruses of applause. For them, the scholarship of a writer is in direct proportion to the recklessness of his attacks on antiquity, and his efforts to undermine tradition and the ecclesiastical magisterium. When one of their number falls under the condemnations of the Church, the rest of them, to the horror of good Catholics, gather round him, heap public praise upon him, venerate him almost as a martyr to truth. The young, excited and confused by all this glamour of praise and abuse, some of them afraid of being branded as ignorant, others ambitious to be considered learned, and both classes goaded internally by curiosity and pride, often surrender and give themselves up to modernism. And here we have already some of the artifices employed by the modernists to exploit their wares. What efforts they make to win new recruits. They seize upon chairs in the seminaries and universities, and gradually make of them chairs of pestilence. From these sacred chairs they scatter, though not always openly, the seeds of their doctrines. They proclaim their teachings without disguise in congresses. They introduce them and make them the vogue in social institutions. Under their own names and under pseudonyms they publish numbers of books, newspapers, reviews, and sometimes one and the same writer adopts a variety of pseudonyms to trap the cautious reader into believing in a whole multitude of modernist writers. In short, they leave nothing untried in action, discourses, writings, as though there were a frenzy of propaganda upon them. And the results of all this? We have to lament the sight of many young men, once full of promise and capable of rendering great services to the truth, now gone astray. And there is another sight that saddens us too. That is so many other Catholics, who, while they certainly do not go so far as the former, have yet grown into the habit, as though they had been breathing a poisoned atmosphere, of thinking and speaking and writing with a liberty that ill becomes Catholics. They are to be found among the laity, and in the ranks of the clergy, and they are not wanting even in the last place, where one might expect to meet them, in religious institutes. If they treat of biblical questions, it is upon modernist principles. If they write history, it is to search out with curiosity and to publish openly, on the pretext of telling the whole truth and with a species of ill-concealed satisfaction, everything that looks to them like a stain in the history of the Church. Under the sway of certain a priori rules, they destroy as far as they can the pious traditions of the people, and bring ridicule on certain relics highly venerable from their antiquity. They are possessed by the empty desire of being talked about, and they know they would never succeed in this were they to say only what has always been said. It may be that they have persuaded themselves that in all this they are really serving God and the Church. In reality, they only offend both, less perhaps by their works themselves than by the spirit in which they write and by the encouragement they are giving to the extravagancies of the modernists. Sound familiar? Can you imagine if some of the modernists today, the high-profile ones, like, say, Father James Martin, if he had been a teacher of actual Orthodox Catholicism, if he approached things from the perspective of the traditional Jesuits, instead of being Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church, imagine how much good he could have done for the Church. Instead, he undermines it. Not necessarily just for the acclaim and the celebrity status that he's been afforded for it, but also to assuage his own feelings and perhaps his own guilt. I won't say why, but you probably know why. Let me know in the comments what you think of all this. Do you recognize what's being said there about the modernists? How many modernists do you see in our time who fit that bill that he describes in that rousing chapter there? Let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly does help. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.